for organising this, especially Alistair, the Executive Director of our Victorian branch. Geoff, I really enjoyed your book, which covers presciently this important and huge field so adroitly. I hear it's already in its second printing, for which hearty congratulations. The temptation for such conversations is always to focus fully on the cause of the day, on mad tweets and the like, aware that there will be time for our large and eager band of participants to pursue those issues more closely in the final 20 minutes of this session. I'm going to stay on course, however, in focusing chiefly, though not entirely, on the themes that you raise in your book. First, you describe how the Communist Party, quotes, gathered together the shards of a broken empire and imposed a modern nation state on them, close quotes. And you talk about your own intriguing travels in Xinjiang and in the Tibetan lands. Is that imposition still a work in process, or has Xi Jinping contrived through his single-mindedness, which also, I guess, means Han-mindedness, to complete that existential challenge for the party?
Well, thanks, Rowan, and can I join you in thanking the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Victoria Branch, and Alistair very much for arranging this, and to you personally as an old friend for giving your time to lead this discussion. And it's a great point to start off, because a key part of my book, when I talk about China's grand strategy, is to look at the origins of the thinking in Beijing about China's grand strategy. Now, you can't find China's grand strategy on a piece of paper anywhere. You have to divine it from their behavior and a range of statements, of course. But the origins of the 49 establishment of a state in 1949, when the Communist Party had to gather together, as you say, the shards of territory to create a nation state. They did not inherit a nation or a state, has shaped, I think, the grand strategy to this very day. And I argue, somewhat counterintuitively, it might seem, if you're sitting in Canberra or Washington, but not if you sit in Beijing, that the strategy is actually based on weakness, not on strength. It's inward looking. It's based principally on the need to maintain territorial integrity. And to your point about the peripheral security of China, Xinjiang, Tibet, of course, Taiwan as unfinished business from 49, these are major constraints on China's behavior. I don't think, to your question, Xi or any leader in China will ever feel comfortable with peripheral security. I think it's an existential concern and continues to this very day. And so when we look at Beijing's obsessiveness about Xinjiang, and you say correctly about my numerous trips there, I've traveled there over seven or eight times, as both officially and as a tourist. And every time I'd return to Beijing, I would say to Chinese officials, look, your heavy-handed behavior, and this goes back well before what we've seen in the last couple of years, your heavy-handed behavior will only create the problems that you're trying to avoid. And they simply don't see that. They are obsessed by security, by maintaining territorial integrity. And I don't think they'll ever feel at ease, no matter how much power they exercise over these areas, that they're stable. And just a last point on this, I'm sure you're keen to move on, Rowan, is that I have in the book figures on China's expenditure on security over the last 10 years, pretty much corresponding with Xi Jinping's period, but precedes Xi by a little bit. China's expenditure on internal security greatly outstrips China's expenditure on external security, so that on the data available 2 years ago, which seems to be the most recent, China is spending 18% more on internal security than external security, despite the massive increase in that expenditure. So I think the short answer is no. Whatever, if you like, the objective reality is, the psychological state of mind is that they will never feel comfortable or relaxed about peripheral security.
Thanks very much, Geoff. And I'll move on to really a really central part of your book, about the new international order, which you refer to, in which great powers do what they wish and the rest do what they can, as you say in the introduction. So China, which the academic Zhu Feng once told me he described as a lonely rising power, and it once sought to stress that its rise was a peaceful one. I'm wondering if that's changed under Xi Jinping, and what that new international order consequently looks like. At present, it's one in which you say Australia is all at sea, and should now build coalitions around liberal values as an answer to that. So I'm interested in how that might happen, and whether this new world will be one in which the US and China each run their own, each comprise hubs of separate economic, tech, security worlds, with China's hinging off its maybe Belt and Road partnerships, and America being entirely separate. This is a very strange version of globalization, isn't it? But so there's a lot of questions in there, but essentially, if you can talk about the new international order and a bit about Australia's place in it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, look, thanks, Rowan. I mean, somewhat challenging and provocatively, I set out in the book to assert that we already have a new world order. There's a lot of talk about the emerging order, the existing chaos in the order. I actually argue that there is a new world order, and it's come about as a result of China's unprecedented economic ascendancy, and that's given it enormous weight. And we've seen the greatest power shift in modern history across the Pacific from the US to China, driven by China's extraordinary economic success. And what we have, and at the same time, particularly under Trump, is the US retreating from leadership of a unipolar order and becoming much more internally focused with Make America Great and so on. And so we have a new order, not as Kissinger at the end of his book on China, which actually got me thinking about this whole thing nearly a decade ago, thought of a G2, of a US and China jointly governing the global commons in a fairly harmonious way, but rather a multipolar order where there are two dominant powers, and as you correctly say, they are the head or the dominant forces in their own bounded order. And this is a concept I take from John Mearsheimer, the super realist geopolitical strategist. And the bounded orders are not exclusive. They're not totally dominated by the main power. And there's points of intersection and points where the main powers, US or China, will cooperate and will work together on matters to do with the global commons. But essentially, in China's case, what has emerged is China as the dominant power of Eurasia. And so effectively from Beijing to Warsaw, China is the dominant power, and Russia has conceded that strategic space. And through Belt and Road, through just sheer economic weight and very clever and adroit diplomacy, China does dominate Eurasia. And in the old geopolitical thinking, Eurasia is the pivot of global affairs. And he who controls Eurasia will dominate global affairs. Now, I don't go that far because I think Russia did dominate Eurasia at one point, but was never the sole shaper of global affairs. But it's an interesting way of looking at the world, and one we are not accustomed to in Australia. And that's really an important point I'm making. So we can pat ourselves on the back and be very pleased that we've banned Huawei from Australia. But while we've been doing that, Huawei has rolled out the digital backbone of the whole of Eurasia. And so whether it's technology, whether it's trade, investment, China dominates. Now, how does it, and the other aspect of the order, which I emphasize, apart from the bounded orders around the US and China, is that it's an order in which autocracies feature quite prominently. Russia, Turkey, Iran, and we can go on through this. Sure, the democracies are still strong and play a role, but their strength has declined relatively to the autocracies. And for Australia, and this is the key point for Australian policy, this is an entirely new world that we're having to deal with. Gone is a world where a single dominant power has shaped and led the order. Previously, Pax Britannica until the British walked away from Singapore in 1942, and then Pax America until the last decade when America started to turn inward and China rose and challenged US power. And so we no longer have a dominant power shaping and leading the order with whose values we're aligned. So it's a very uncomfortable and challenging place for Australia. And the third part of my book deals with the foreign policy outlook and the foreign policy challenges we will face. And that part is called Australia's dystopian future. Now, I mean, the publishers tried to stop me using the word dystopian, and we had a debate using the OED, Oxford English Dictionary, and so on. But I said, look, it's an arresting phrase, and they had to concede that. It is arresting. But I think it does make the point, even if it's not literally correct. And that is, this is going to be a world for Australian policymakers which we're uncomfortable with, we don't like, we don't welcome, but that's the facts. And that is a situation that we have to start to adjust our policy to.
So, nevertheless, in your book, you praise, rightly in my view, the former DFAT head, Peter Varghese, who's urged Australia to consider ways, he's also urged Australia to consider ways in which it might be able to help constrain, but not contain China. And your central chapter is on that, the ties that bind China you talked about just now. Could you explain how in an economic way, China might also be bound? You talk about its limited resources and energy sources, for example, and how Australia might help constrain it if it does have a role in there. And you say Australia needs to disappoint China without offending it. That does seem a bit of a challenge when it seems to take offence so readily.
Well, again, Rowan, there's a lot of elements in that. The second part of the book, which is really the key part of the book, is about what I call China as Prometheus bound, the constrained superpower. And I should say a little bit about that, because I think when we sit here in Australia and we worry about is China a threat or not, we need to understand China's capacity. It may have the most evil intents in the world, but what is its capacity to realize those objectives? And throughout the book, I'm arguing at various points, including in Belt and Road, that its capacity will fall far short of whatever its intents may be. And the Belt and Road, I say over again, that it will overpromise and underdeliver. And I think with the pushback against the Belt and Road we see around the world, that's exactly what's happening. But China is a constrained superpower, in my view, for four main reasons. One, geography. 14 countries on its border, 22,000 kilometres of land border to defend. Massive forces are required just to secure the borders. And remember my arguments about China's grand strategy and the central place that territorial integrity plays in that. In fact, that's what it's about. And as I said, it's a strategy based on weakness. Secondly, and to your earlier question, Rowan, about peripheral security, China is still an empire. It's inherited the territory of the Qing, not entirely. It's given some back to Mongolia, back to Russia, and so on, back to Kazakhstan. But essentially, it has unresolved territorial issues inside its border. and hence the huge expenditure of internal security, even greater than external security. 3, and this is a very, very important part of the book, and I think something you'd relate to, Rowan, having lived through it like I've lived through it, is China rapidly and unexpectedly turning from being a country that is, or an economy that is self-sufficient in all the natural resources, all the minerals and energy it needs to stay alive, to becoming the global biggest importer of all of those things. And that happened in an extraordinary short period of time. As recently as 1995, China is self-sufficient in crude oil. By the late 90s, it's starting to import crude oil. A decade later, it's the world's single biggest importer of crude oil. And I've got a subsection of the resource constraint book, a chapter called The Iron Ore Wars. And, you know, we all lived through those last decade. And it's all unexpected. And all those resources, of course, go through the South China Sea or the Straits of Malacca. And I'm sure everyone's heard of those places these days. From a Beijing perspective, these are key strategic choke points that the US can shut off in a heartbeat. It's been said in Beijing that the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea are the boot on China's throat. So from a Beijing perspective, and I think that's a unique thing the book brings as well, you know, a Western diplomat, economist, analyst, but trying to look at the world through Beijing eyes. These are massive vulnerabilities, and it was never anticipated, and we can talk more about that. And then I argue that China has very little soft power because the importance of, or the role the Communist Party plays in filtering China's external image and messaging, which may sell well in China, but doesn't sell overseas. So China is a constrained superpower. How we constrain China, I think it's not about us. If the implication we won't sell the iron ore. If we don't want to sell the iron ore, I'd like to see what the Rio, BHP and Fortescue shareholders think about that. We have to constrain China by building strong coalitions of countries that can say to China, you know, we welcome your rise. We want to create space for your rise. And we welcome China as, we welcome ongoing and substantial engagement with China. But you, China, must realize bad behavior will carry costs. And we must be able to deliver on that. And it's not easy. It clearly isn't easy. And thanks for quoting the the line from Thucydides about great powers doing what they want and the rest of us doing what we can. That is the reality for Australia of a realist foreign policy. But I think there are things to do, and I spend a bit of time in the book talking about what we did in the 80s and 90s in terms of coalition building. Now, the world's changed dramatically since then, of course. These things are much harder, but through our diplomacy in the past, we have been able to lead regional coalitions. And I think there's plenty of opportunity to do that again.
Thanks very much, Geoff. And I might add as a postscript that in terms of its constraints, it spends more importing semiconductors each year than it does oil. So that's, and you can't just build up a semiconductor industry to meet its needs overnight. The economy, and you were, of course, a leading economist before you were a diplomat. And I wrote quite a long piece in last weekend's The Australian asking whether China's economic growth might over time, given its demographic and economic challenges and its political parameters, taper off towards the global mean. Is China's continuing economic rise, which is the key to the party's domestic legitimacy, really, and to its international ambitions, is it inexorable?
Yeah, look, that's an absolutely great question, and I absolutely agree with the premises of the question as well, including the central part that economic growth plays for the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. I look at it a bit differently, and I've been working on the Chinese economy on and off for 35 years.
Yeah.
I've always been an optimist on the Chinese economy. and it's never disappointed. And I'm still optimistic, at least for quite a while. But I think you phrased and you shaped the question extremely well, Rowan. What I say to this is as follows: China is a vast continental economy of 1.4 billion people, the likes of which doesn't exist and never has existed anywhere else. And what you see is, I think, basic economics 101 operating in China, with the very rapid growth of the past 15 years. China on the Eastern Littoral has created a global middle class of about 300 million people. We can go through the cities, and just even recently, a year ago, I thought I'd been almost everywhere. I went to some city I'd never heard of 6 million people, and it's on the Eastern Seaboard, and it's rich. And that's what drives our high-valued wine exports, our high-valued beef exports, drives everything. And if you look at their growth rates, your point about converging to the global norm as you develop and catch up to the global production possibility frontier is exactly right. So if you look at the Eastern Littoral, growth rates there are not bad. They're robust by international standards, but they're low by Chinese historical standards in the reform period. And Shanghai's got a growth rate of 2.5%, 3%, maybe 3.5 in a good year. That's what you expect from a fully developed country economy. And the structure of production and consumption similar. It's basically a services-based economy. But it's 300 million people. It's the size of the United States. Not as high yet in per capita terms, but getting there. But then there's a vast central part of China, from the northeast to the northwest to all those provinces that sit in behind the littoral, where you have economies at levels of development which approximate emerging economies, which are dynamic and have high growth rates. And there you can expect high growth rates, maybe in the sort of 7-8% range, to continue for quite some time. And as industry relocates from the developed areas to the less developed areas, and you're talking about maybe 700 million people. And then there's the rest, which are poor and a less developed economy level growth rates. And so I would argue what confounds so many analysts is the capacity for catch-up internally. And they're thinking about China as something other than what it is, a vast continental economy of 1.4 billion people. And I don't do it much these days, but when I used to mix in the circles of senior policy makers in Beijing and so on, that was their view. Look, we've got 1 billion people to develop. We've got years and years to run this model of high growth, high investment before we catch up.
That would be. Can I interrupt? That may be made more difficult if the private sector is pushed down. I think this is my personal view. And reports indicate that the private sector in China is still struggling to gain access to credit. And the decision by Beijing last month to kibosh the world's biggest float, $35 billion of A&T Finance, which is led by Alibaba founder Jack Ma, just 2 days before, sends quite a big signal that Jack, China's most famous businessman, is just another person on the street, really. So how's the private sector, the market, going in China? Is it being put back into the bird cage? And you refer in the book to Chen Yun's description of the bird cage, or the being the state, and the bird being the market or the private sector.
Well, I hope we're not going back to that debate, but we may well be under Xi. Look, I think the bird's well and truly flown in China, and we've got to be careful not to overstate the regression. I haven't been on the ground for a year, and it's true, things change remarkably quickly. But I think the private sector, by and large, is still very dynamic, very big. Last time I looked, it still accounted for 70% of GDP. your point about Ant and Jack Ma, I think is very good, very well made. But what I'd say on that, Rowan, is that it's entirely political. I just think that Jack Ma got too big to succeed. You know, we have this notion of too big to fail. I think in China, too big to succeed, too big for the Communist Party to manage. So they had to cut him off at the knees. And I wasn't surprised. The thing that surprised me with Ant was that it was allowed to run on for so long.
Yeah.
When I first started seeing analyst estimates, I thought, you could buy the Communist Party for that much money. And I'm sure it's up for sale, so, but no, I think the private sector is still active and very dynamic, albeit more constrained in the formal credit markets. But this is always the thing. The informal credit markets are what drives so many of these new financial intermediaries like Ant Finance.
Thanks. And before, there's a couple of things I want to touch on just before we move on to Australia again. You highlight the changes wrought under Xi Jinping. What kind of a person is he, and what kind of a leader? How has he changed China, and will the party be able to find a successor in his mold? There's none on the horizon yet.
No, and they're all great questions, and I wish I had some answers for them. I can give a little colour about Xi Jinping, and I've probably, strangely enough, spent more time with him than probably most foreigners. I met him many times, at least 4 times when he was first of all party secretary of Shanghai for that brief period in 2007 before he was elevated to Beijing, several times in Beijing. But also I had the good fortune to travel with him for 6 days in Australia in June 2010, when he made a tremendous visit and travelled to Kakadu National Park. And he struck me as a very personable, pleasant guy to be with. My Chinese is pretty ordinary. He speaks no English as far as I can tell. But, things like he wanted to go to Kakadu to see Aboriginal cave paintings because he had a personal interest in them. He'd read about them. And he met the last person from their tribe or their clan who was the guide who took him around. And on the trip back from Kakadu to Darwin that afternoon, he returned to me several times to say, how could this person be the last person from the clan? What would this person do? Who would he marry? And I thought of it as a very Han Chinese view of the world. Imagine being Han Chinese and thinking you've met the last person in an ethnic group. He really struggled to understand how that can happen and what it meant for that individual. And he was great. I mean, he stood in the bottom in the front of a boat in baking sun with each one of his staff members and all the crew to have a photo taken with a big fat crocodile behind him. People might have wished the crocodile had an appetite. There you are. But so I don't know. But look, I reviewed Richard McGregor's very good book on backlash last year for the Lowy Institute.
Yeah.
And what I said about Xi there, and I think it's not really appreciated, is that Xi came in with a power struggle. He had to beat off Bo Xilai.
Yeah.
Up until then, Deng Xiaoping and Deng's successors had instituted a form of political reform, the institutionalization of the transition of power, and that had stood China very well. And for those of us who were in the embassy in the 80s, we talked more in many ways about political reform than economic reform. Economic reform seemed to be half-baked, but what Deng was doing on the political side seemed to be remarkable. It's all gone. And I think the fact that Xi took power by a power struggle, it wouldn't matter who he was, what his personality was, he then inherited a Leninist political system again. They went back to the Leninist origins of the Communist Party. No institutional mechanism for the transfer of power. Kill or be killed. And, Xi's anti-corruption campaign, as we now know in retrospect, had a very big agenda of getting rid of threats and challenges. And he has to rule with an iron fist. He has to control because he can be done over. And, in many ways, I think that's an aspect that's missing in our current debate about China's foreign policy. Because we don't know how the system works at the centre, we don't know how to connect the domestic political dynamics with what China does internationally.
That's and that leads to one or two questions I've got about the Australian side. Understand how we understand China better. And you'll know this well, that Australia scarcely invested in China at all, compared with a lot of other countries, Japan, Korea, Germany, US, and so on. And so we've had very few senior corporate execs living there. And in fact, hard to locate any people in Australia running companies, universities, government departments, or on their main boards who've lived in Asia at all, let alone in China. So how can we start to understand China, and maybe Asia, I'll leave that, but China better?
Well, I mean, doing what we haven't done well, which is what you've set out very clearly. But now, Rowan, and you'll appreciate this more than anyone else, we're in a situation where there are no Australian journalists working for Australian agencies. There are Australian journalists working in China, but they're working for the BBC or other agencies. This is extraordinary. This is our largest trading partner. This is the dominant power of the region. For every country in East Asia, China is the biggest market. And for many, it's the biggest investor. And yet we don't have a media presence left in China. It is an extraordinary state of affairs. And it would be good if we talked about that more in Australia. And I agree. I mean, I've got to be careful in this because I do have China experience and I do sit on a number of boards. But I do think it helps if directors have China experience.
But you're a bit of a lone, but you must feel a bit lonely on some of them, I guess.
Yeah, well, they're all very polite to me, so yeah. That's okay. But yeah.
Now, if I could just go, you were intimately involved from the start when, as DepSec, you ran DFAT's trade division in the decade-long negotiations for a free trade agreement with China. This current trail of economic sanctions, does that negate the value of that agreement? I mean, how do you feel about that after putting so much effort into it?
Yeah, look, well, it does in practice. It does, and you can't mince words about it. It is not ever what was intended, of course, and no one would have expected that after all the fanfare of signing the agreement in 2014, we are where we are today. Of course, things like anti-dumping duties on wine and so on. The agreement foreshadows that if there's anti-dumping, you have recourse to WTO mechanisms. All bilateral trade agreements work like that, basically. But it's the principle and the spirit. And economic coercion is a weapon of choice for China's statecraft. There's a lot of explanation in the book about why that's the case. The short answer is China has very few other instruments of statecraft other than its enormous economic weight. And so it's obvious that it will revert to using economic coercion, no matter how objectionable and distasteful that is. But you're right. I mean, it's utterly against the spirit of what we negotiated in 2014.
Your successor as ambassador in Beijing, Francis Adamson, who now heads DFAT, said a week ago that China seems set on determining the terms of its international engagement. Is that right? And is that where Australia appears to be causing such angst in Beijing? Because we've kind of failed to accommodate to the terms that China has set for us. And we've got that list of 14 boxes we need to tick and so on. We've failed to be shifted by that economic coercion so far. That must be a bit frustrating for the playbook of the foreign ministry, the new wolf warrior-ish foreign ministry. That's obviously a new type of setup from the one that you had to deal with as ambassador. Well,
let me take Francis' comments first. I mean, I have a problem with it only because that's the sort of partly what I'm trying to address, the thinking that I'm trying to address in the book. It's the naivety of the comment. All great powers do that. All great powers will want to set the terms of their engagement with the international community. It's ever thus and ever will be. And that's what I'm saying. We have to come to grips with that. That doesn't mean you roll over and have your tummy tickled, but you have to understand your starting point is that's what they do. So it's almost as obvious as saying the sun rises in the east. What I think is very disappointing in Australia is that the debate now has been cast in a binary choice between sycophancy, rolling over to China, or hostility. And we're down the hostility end, and that there's no space in between. Whereas every other country that shares our liberal democratic values, for whom China is the dominant market and economic partner, have managed their relationship differently than we have. Now, what I say on the 14 points, which I think was a really dumb thing for the embassy to do, and ham-fisted, is that from an Australian perspective, the issue is more, to me, how we've managed to advance our interests, behave according to our interests and our values, rather than actually doing so. And that's why, I wrote last week in my AFR column, the curious thing is that Australia has somehow become an outlier amongst our marker countries. So, the Prime Minister rushes off to Japan, breaks protocol by going to see the new Prime Minister rather than waiting for the new Prime Minister to come to Australia. Big message to China, signing a military agreement, which still no one really knows what it's about. The Prime Minister seemed to have great trouble explaining to the media in Tokyo what it was about. A lot of fanfare. And the day he leaves, who turns up? None other than Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, who's talking about advancing the trilateral free trade agreement between Japan and South Korea and a whole lot of stuff. I mean, the contrast can't be greater between the state of our relationship with China and the state of all the market countries with whose values we share and their relations with China. So we have to ask ourselves, why has it got to this state? And my book tries to provide two answers, although I must say the manuscript was submitted on the 1st of June and hasn't, other than typos and endnotes, as you know, doing books yourself, Rowan, have been changed. But basically, the problem for us is that we have joined with the United States in a much more obvious and direct way in seeking to contain China's rise and resisting China than any of our market countries, our friends, New Zealand or Japan or South Korea. And at the same time, our diplomacy hasn't been very good in terms of managing issues. For example, when on the South China Sea, the Hague judgment 2016, we had the most strident voice. When Turnbull 2018 brought in the anti-foreign interference law, which is supposed to be non-discriminatory, that is applies to all countries, and many countries interfere in Australia's internal affairs. Turnbull spoke in Chinese saying, Adalia ran Jiangqi Laila, paraphrasing Mao Zedong's statement when he said at the founding of the People's Republic that China had stood up against 100 years of colonial oppression, territorial occupation. When I was in Beijing then, Chinese friends educated in the US, PhDs from the best US schools, were just saying, shaking their heads, saying, what's Australia doing? What's all this about? And it goes on, episode after episode, until you get to Morrison's, our Prime Minister's, call for an independent inquiry into the origin of COVID-19. No, not in company, by ourselves, following a telephone call with President Trump, when Trump was hitting extremely hard on China over the Wuhan virus, the China flu, you name it. And we blurt out this stuff. I mean, no one worried. The call for an inquiry is perfectly reasonable. It's unexceptional. And China has joined the WHO's inquiry. But we don't need to do that. And we have to understand in our diplomacy, we have to recognize that it's an asymmetrical relationship. And people hate me saying it, but it's true. We need China more than China needs us.
Thank you.
We need to be smart and we need to be disciplined.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm going to try and be, let's try and be smart and disciplined. I just need to touch on one thing before we throw it over to the participants, which is your connections with China's art world are quite substantial. And you've donated much of your China collection, I know, to La Tribune, your alma mater. you cite Wang Jise as saying soft power originates more from a society than from a state. So what are the consequences of China having a state that doesn't really trust its own society sufficiently to let it express itself fully, to let China be the cultural China that you know well?
No, absolutely, Rowan. And look, there's a whole chapter on China's lack of soft power, and this is a big problem. And it's partly why I say that China doesn't have many instruments of statecraft at its disposal. It's constrained on use of hard power. Its soft power is massively diminished by the fact that everything has to go through the Communist Party's narrative. And so you're left with sharp power. Economic coercion we've talked about, political interference, corruption, you name it. But on the contemporary Chinese art movement, I think it's one reason why I really was attracted to it and have been for the last 35 years. And it underscores the complexity of contemporary China, despite the role of the party, despite the increasing heavy-handedness of Xi Jinping, a diverse cultural space still operates. It's private, it's outside the state. I did a book launch last night at Vermilion Gallery in Sydney that specialises in contemporary Chinese art, and the walls were hung with remarkably creative, audacious, cynical works of art. And it all comes out of China, and the artist is very rich. And
thank you.
And this flourishes, and it underscores the complexity of contemporary China.
Great. Thanks very much, Geoff. And that's a good note, I think, on which to throw it over to Alistair.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rowan, very much for leading that conversation. And we've covered some great ground. I'll dive straight in. The first question to Geoff. Could you offer a view on the ladder of escalation in tensions between China and Australia? I mean, are the two seeing this through different prisms? Is it inevitable it's going to keep ratcheting up, or do you see a chance of a reset?
Yes, I mean, we are in the ladder of escalation is a good metaphor. I use it as basically downward spiral of tit-for-tat retaliation, same thing. And yes, we are, and it's been going on since March. I think what happened, and it's no criticism of Australian officials here at all, but with the wolf warrior diplomacy, although, by the way, I must go back to Rowan and wolf warrior diplomacy, if I may. I talk about the wolf warrior diplomacy of the very erudite, chic, sophisticated Fu Ying back in the middle of last decade over iron ore prices. So it doesn't just begin this year. But the wolf warrior diplomacy post the Prime Minister's call for an inquiry, I think, was seen in Canberra as crossing a line, and people had determined after that Australia would hit back. And that started now, this tit-for-tat spiral downwards as fault on both sides, or action and reaction on both sides. We've done a lot on foreign investment, and we've done raids on Chinese journalists in Sydney, Asia raids, and Chinese academics have been denied visas on rather debatable grounds, and it's on the Chinese side as well, as we know. So where does this end? And I have to say, I sitting here today, I'm not sure. It will end at some point. How much damage will be done to both interests, China's interest and our own, I don't know. But I thought the Prime Minister made two very good and conciliatory statements last week. He didn't talk about the bilateral relationship per se, but he acknowledged, which we should do, China's major contribution to the region, to itself through removing poverty, 300 million people out of poverty, through many things. And I was hugely disappointed when, following that, we got the 14 points, and then the Prime Minister made another statement, and then we got the wine tariff, and then we got this this tweet. And quite clearly, China is upping the ante, even though I don't necessarily think those three actions are closely coordinated. but the net effect is they're upping the ante. And I think for now, we just have to try and avoid accidents on both sides, say as little as possible, and let the flux of time. And the key thing, I guess, coming up now is the ascendancy of Joe Biden to the US presidency. That may provide an opportunity for a reset.
Absolutely. Well, the infamous tweet was obviously going to get a question, but I was going to broaden that out to wolf warrior diplomacy slightly more broadly, Geoff. I mean, is that aimed more at a domestic audience, do you think, or is there any perception now that perhaps it's becoming counterproductive in the international arena?
Well, I think because it's becoming and is counterproductive internationally, you have to look for an explanation. I mean, they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot willingly, and I don't think China's in the business of just gratuitously creating enemies, as is sometimes asserted in some of the media commentary in Australia. I think you have to ask yourself, well, what are the domestic political drivers of this? And I think for someone like Xi Jinping in his position, he cannot at any point be seen to be weak or accommodating. And the problem we all have in dealing with China, and I'm certainly not saying this to excuse the Chinese leadership, they've gone out and created such a mass of internationally oriented but populist nationalists that is a very powerful and potentially very dangerous force that the leadership is constantly trying to control. And we know that this tweet, for example, didn't originate with the government, originated with a blogger, a very radical and extreme blogger, but nonetheless, that person's got a very big following. And it's awful that the foreign ministry spokesman Zhao legitimized it by putting it on his tweet. But the point is, there is a very strong patriotic nationalist sentiment in China, and even internationally educated, Western-oriented elites in China look at Australia's behaviour and say, "What's Australia doing? Why is it doing this?"
Thank you. There'd been a question that was relating to Rowan's article in the Australian last weekend about China's economy might start to weaken its ambitions. Just what are your views on the pressures of demographics as the population is becoming older? What do you think that's going to have to be? I suppose it could be either, but.
Well, I might start by just saying that the working population of China has been in decline now, or has started to decline in a few years. So what we've got is combined with the one-child policy, which is now over, but the end of that hasn't led to an acceleration in births. So what we're going to see is large numbers of people, elderly people, being supported by smaller numbers of people in work. That's going to need a lot of capital, a lot of savings, and making people anxious about their future. And so when China's looking to consumption to drive future growth in the economy, people are a little bit nervous about that. And robotics is one answer, of course, for demographic problems, and Japan has the same answer ready. But Japan has got rich before it got old. China suffers the challenge. It's getting old before, Geoff said 300 million are middle class, before quite a lot of people are getting as rich as they would like and feel entitled.
Thank you. Can I move on to another thing? Australia, some time back, supported the China-led Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I think against perhaps the desires of the US. Do you think that has been of benefit to us, or in the current circumstances, does it?
Look, you're okay, Alistair, for me to go? Yeah, look, it's a really great question, and I don't think we talk enough about these things. I could go on for ages, and there's a fair bit in the book about the AIB, but yes, it's been a good thing. It hasn't delivered a lot yet because they've been so busy putting in good governance and proper processes that it's actually taken a long time. It's widely regarded by observers and so on as being a proper, normal, international, multilateral institution. The interesting thing is that our cabinet split over that back in 2014 under the pressure of the US. We did eventually join, but I can assure you in the current situation, we would never join another body like that again until we work through our foreign policy and have a more independent foreign policy from the US than we do today. And, you know, it's perfectly legitimate for a great power to want to put in place international arrangements and architecture. And I think the American resistance to it was it suddenly saw China was doing what the US did in the late 40s at the end of the Second World War with the Bretton Woods institutions, which were used to basically cement US preeminence over Great Britain and undo British global power. So I think it's working. It's not doing a lot still because it's been slow to get all the governance processes in place. But it is welcome as a new and the newest form of multilateral architecture in the international system. And this is the point about containing China. China has every right to create architecture. And in its own sphere, in Eurasia, it's built the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, something you never hear of in Australia. But this is a multinational organization. Most recently, India and Pakistan joined at the same time. And one of the sort of principles that binds the Shanghai Cooperation Organization together is to stand against the West.
If I could just add, I agree with Geoff on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's intriguing how it's succeeded at standing apart and doing, as Geoff said, building up good compliance and governance. Under its managing director, it declined to be one of the funders of the Belt and Road Initiative, leaving that to China Development Bank and Exim Bank. So it was quite an impressive piece of political work, I think, that it kept out of the much more grey and complicated and politicized and potentially corrupt spending through Belt and Road. And so full marks to that institution and to its international relations. It's kept very good contacts with the Asian Development Bank, interestingly enough, and which has been traditionally Japanese led.
Thank you. But I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and we've got so many questions. We'll try and get through some fairly promptly still. Just briefly, Taiwan has been talked about many times as a potential flashpoint. Do you think the new Biden administration lessens the likelihood of any issues around Taiwan?
I'll try and be quick. I don't think it lessens the likelihood because of the Taiwan Defense Act that's in Congress. So US has certain obligations and obligations to sell arms. What I'd say on Taiwan is what I say in the book is that I just don't think Beijing has a military option for Taiwan. It can threaten. I don't think logistically it makes that it's feasible to attack and invade Taiwan in some sense. A blockade would invite a similar blockade of China, and the US would shut down the supply of many of the raw materials and energy that China depends on. But I think the key thing with Taiwan is that I cannot imagine a Chinese leadership having Han Chinese killing other Han Chinese on a great scale. I don't think a leadership in Beijing could survive that.
This Xi Jinping has said Taiwan is however, he said it's a this generation issue which needs resolving now. And his place in the party pantheon would be cemented if he managed to reassume Taiwan. And one or two people have said Hong Kong's subjugation, if you can put it like that, provides a bit of a model, so troublemakers can be sent to the mainland for trial and incarceration.
Yeah, but the difference with Hong Kong, I think Beijing's got the same problem in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. In both places, the younger generation have no interest in being part of the mainland. The difference is with Hong Kong, unlike Taiwan, is that the British colonial power, without any reference to the Hong Kong people, gave Hong Kong back to a communist-ruled China. And since 1st of July 1997, everyone in the world has recognized Hong Kong as China's sovereign territory. The conditions are vastly different. The problem's the same, but the conditions are vastly different.
Thank you. Just to move on to environment briefly, China's commitment to reducing its emissions by 2060 and its general challenges, is that more about China's ambitions in the multilateral arena than its actual concerns about the environment?
Oh, look, they've certainly got ambitions in the multilateral area, and I think it's going to be one of the first areas we will see, cooperation between the Biden administration and China. And of course, if you're going to cooperate on the global commons, you're going to have to improve your bilateral relations. So I think there are some signs to be optimistic about the US-China relationship. But China's got huge environmental problems itself. Climate change isn't such a big one because you can't feel or touch greenhouse gas emissions, but the melting of the glaciers in Tibet is a major existential threat to China.
Thank you. Well, maybe we can get in one or two more questions briefly. You talked about China being the dominant power in Eurasia. There's a question that could Australia better understand China if they had more of a footprint in Central Asia, an embassy or more boots on the ground?
Short answer is yes, because it's a huge part of the world that's a blank hole on our map of the world. Canberra's mental map, there's just a great blank spot, which is called Central Asia.
And the AIIA is still planning to have a visit there. So if I can add a plug, Alistair.
We are indeed. Silk Road study tour.
And if I could add a plug, I've written a very fun travel piece of Central Asia when I went around a couple of years ago. I recommend it to the audience.
Absolutely. Well, that's look. We're up to our hour, and I know that our guests have other priorities. So I think, look, there's been great involvement from the audience. Understand me, some great questions. We were never going to get through them all. So apologies to the audience we couldn't get through. What I could say is, if we haven't answered your question, buy the book. Because there's lots in there.
Poster behind me.
We are recording. We'll send out a link, and when we send the link, we'll just send the link to where you can buy the book. But I wish we could go on another hour for this. I wish we could. But from my side, thank you very much, Rowan, for leading the conversation, and Geoff, in particular, to you for taking the trouble and coming on, and such a wide-ranging and fascinating talk. And thank you to the audience for participation. But I'll give you the final word to say farewell, if you like, the two of you.
Oh, thanks, Alice. Look, I really want to thank the Institute for having me and giving me this opportunity, but also very much to Rowan for leading the discussion and the effort he put into reading the book, and great questions, one of the best I've done. So thank you so much, Rowan. Thank you, Alistair, and thanks to the Institute. Thank you to the audience.
Yeah,
thanks,
and
Geoff.
thank you to all. And we just look forward to being able to do this in person before too long. That'd be even.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Bye.
Okay.
All right.